The rain fell in a steady drizzle, painting the streets of Crestwood in a glossy sheen. Officer Dan Harris sat in his patrol car, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. He'd been on edge all day, his mood as dark as the storm clouds overhead. Crestwood was supposed to be a quiet, upscale neighborhood, but Dan had long since grown suspicious of anyone who didn't fit his idea of what a resident should look like. That's when he saw it, a sleek black Lexus gliding through the intersection, its windows tinted just a shade too dark for his liking. Dan's eyes narrowed. The driver was a black man, dressed in a sharp suit, his hands resting casually on the wheel. Dan's instincts kicked in. No way a guy like that owns a car like this, he thought, his jaw tightening. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and siren. The Lexus pulled over smoothly, and Dan approached with his usual swagger, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. He rapped sharply on the window, and it rolled down to reveal the driver, a man in his late 30s with an air of quiet confidence. License and registration. Dan barked, his tone clipped. The man nodded, reaching slowly into his glove compartment. Dan's eyes darted around the interior of the car, searching for anything out of place. The leather seats, the high-end sound system, it all screamed money. Too much money for someone like him, Dan thought. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. Dan bristled at the tone. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, stepping back to make room. The man hesitated, his gaze locking with Dan's. "Am I being detained?" Dan's patience snapped. "You're being suspicious," he shot back. "Now get out of the car before I make you." The man sighed but complied, stepping out into the rain. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but commanding. Dan felt a flicker of unease but pushed it aside. He was in control here. As Dan began patting him down, the man spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing, officer." Dan ignored him, his mind already racing with assumptions. But as he reached for his radio to call and the license plate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this stop was about to go very, very wrong. The rain continued to fall, soaking both men as Dan Harris patted down the driver, his movements rough and hurried. The man stood still, his arms slightly raised, his expression unreadable. Dan's unease grew with every passing second. But he pushed it down, focusing on his task. "You got a name?" Dan asked gruffly, stepping back to examine the driver's license. "Marcus Johnson." The man replied, his voice steady. Dan glanced at the license, then back at Marcus. "This your car, Mr. Johnson's?" "It is," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. Dan smirked, unconvinced. "You sure about that? A car like this doesn't come cheap." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I'm sure. Is there a problem, officer?" Dan's jaw tightened. He hated being questioned, especially by someone like Marcus. "We'll see about that. Stay here." He returned to his patrol car, his partner, Officer Ramirez, watching him with a raised eyebrow. "What's going on, Dan?" "Guy's driving a Lexus in a suit." "Something's off," Dan muttered, running Marcus's information through the system. Ramirez glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly in the rain, his hands now in his pockets. "He doesn't look like he's causing trouble." "Looks can be deceiving," Dan snapped, his eyes glued to the computer screen. As the system processed the information, Dan's radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we've got a 10 to 78 at the corner of 5th and Maple. Backup requested." Dan hesitated, glancing back at Marcus. He didn't want to let this go, but duty called. "We'll have to cut this short," he said, stepping out of the car. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Am I free to go, officer?" Dan's jaw clenched. "Not so fast. I'll be keeping your license. We're not done here." Marcus's calm demeanor faltered for the first time, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "You're holding my license without cause? Do you realize what you're doing?" Dan stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "I'm doing my job. Now get back in your car and wait for further instructions." Marcus didn't move, his gaze locking with Dan's. "You're making a mistake, Officer Harris." Dan froze. "How do you know my name?" Marcus didn't answer, his expression unreadable once more. Dan's unease deepened. But before he could respond, Ramirez called out from the car. "Dan, you need to see this." Dan turned, his heart pounding as he approached the patrol car. On the computer screen, Marcus Johnson's information flashed back, but it wasn't what Dan expected. "Oh no," Ramirez muttered, his face pale. Dan's stomach dropped as he read the screen. Marcus Johnson wasn't just any civilian. He was the new head of internal affairs. Dan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the screen, the words glaring back at him. Marcus Johnson, head of internal affairs. His stomach churned, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He glanced back at Marcus, who stood in the rain, his arms crossed, watching him with a calm, almost expectant expression. "Dan, what do we do?" Ramirez whispered, his voice tinged with panic. Dan's mind raced. He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, but his pride refused to let him back down. "We stick to the story," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He stepped out of the patrol car, his legs feeling like lead. Marcus raised an eyebrow as Dan approached, his badge glinting in the dim light. "Officer Harris," Marcus said, his tone measured but firm, "I assume you've confirmed my identity?" Dan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Yeah, looks like you're who you say you are." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good. Now, would you like to explain why you felt the need to detain me without probable cause?" Dan's jaw tightened. "I had reason to believe the vehicle might be stolen." "Protocol?" Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Dan saw a flicker of anger in them. "Protocol? Or profiling?" Dan flinched, but stood his ground. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly, "is to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. Do you have any idea how many complaints Internal Affairs has received about your conduct?" Dan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Marcus stepped closer, his presence commanding despite the rain soaking his suit. "You're going to report to my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Bring your partner and any relevant documentation from this stop. Do I make myself clear?" Dan nodded mutely, his pride crumbling under the weight of Marcus's authority. "Good," Marcus said, his tone final. He held out his hand. "My license, Officer Harris." Dan fumbled with the card, handing it back without a word. Marcus took it, his gaze lingering on Dan for a moment longer before he turned and walked back to his car. As the Lexus pulled away, Dan stood frozen in the rain, the reality of the situation sinking in. Ramirez approached cautiously, his face pale. "Dan, what just happened?" Dan didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could think about was the storm that was about to hit and how he might not survive it. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with whispers. News of Dan's encounter with Marcus Johnson had spread like wildfire, and the tension was palpable. Officers avoided eye contact with Dan as he walked through the halls, his uniform crisp but his face pale and drawn. Ramirez trailed behind him, equally uneasy. Dan's mind replayed the previous night on a loop, Marcus's calm authority, the way he'd dismantled Dan's confidence with just a few words. He'd barely slept, tossing and turning as he imagined the worst-case scenarios, suspension, demotion, even termination. When they reached the Internal Affairs office, Dan hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Ramirez gave him a nervous glance. "You ready for this?" Dan didn't answer. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was stark and formal, with Marcus Johnson seated at the head of a long table. He looked every bit the authority figure now, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. Two other IA officers flanked him, their faces stern. "Officer Harris," Marcus said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit." Dan obeyed, his movements stiff. Ramirez sat beside him, fidgeting with his hat. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Let's start with the facts. Last night, you initiated a traffic stop on my vehicle without probable cause. You detained me, questioned me, and implied that I was engaged in criminal activity. Do you deny any of this?" Dan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips. The dashcam footage from the patrol car played on a screen behind Marcus, showing every moment of the stop in glaring detail. Dan's aggressive tone, his unfounded accusations, it was all there. I was doing my job," Dan said weakly, though even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. Your job, Marcus repeated, his tone sharp, is not to profile individuals based on their race or appearance. Your actions were unprofessional, discriminatory, and a violation of department policy. Dan's stomach churned. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was just trying to keep the streets safe, but the evidence was damning. Marcus leaned back, his gaze piercing. Officer Harris, this isn't the first complaint we've received about your conduct, but it will be the last. You have two choices. Accept a suspension, mandatory sensitivity training, and community service, or face termination and a formal investigation. The room fell silent. Dan's hands clenched into fists under the table, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, he nodded. I'll take the training, he muttered. Marcus's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. Good. This is your chance to change, Officer Harris. Don't waste it. As Dan left the office, the weight of his actions settled over him like a storm cloud. He knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. The weeks that followed were a blur for Dan Harris. His suspension was humiliating, the mandatory sensitivity training a constant reminder of his mistakes. He attended community service events, standing awkwardly on the sidelines as people eyed him with suspicion. The once confident officer now moved through life like a shadow, haunted by the consequences of his actions. One evening, as Dan sat alone in his apartment, a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Marcus Johnson standing there, his expression unreadable. "Can I come in?" Marcus asked. Dan hesitated, then stepped aside. Marcus entered, glancing around the sparse living room before turning to face Dan. "I'm not here to lecture you," Marcus said, his tone softer than Dan expected. "I'm here to ask you a question." Dan frowned. "What question? Why did you become a cop?" The question caught Dan off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, memories flooded his mind. His father, retired officer, pinning a badge on his uniform the day he graduated from the academy, the pride he'd felt swearing to protect and serve. The first time he'd helped a lost child find their way home. "I wanted to make a difference," Dan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded. "Then why did you lose sight of that?" Dan looked away, his chest tight. "I don't know. I guess I got jaded. Started seeing the worst in people." Marcus studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Being a cop isn't about power, Dan. It's about responsibility. You have the ability to change lives, for better or worse. What you do with that power defines you." Dan's throat tightened. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices. Not just the stop with Marcus, but every biased decision, every harsh word, every moment he'd let his prejudice cloud his judgment. "I don't know if I can fix this," Dan admitted, his voice breaking. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not about fixing the past. It's about building a better future. You have a chance to do that now. Don't waste it." As Marcus left, Dan stood in the doorway, the rain falling softly around him. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Dan was ready to walk it. He had a lot to make up for, and for the first time, he was willing to try.